There are some things that we can't see, and so there's often debate about whether or not they actually exist. With the technology that we have today, we can't see life on Mars. So some people think there is life on Mars, other people think that there isn't. And it's similar when a person dies. When someone dies, we can see what happens to their body. It's maybe placed in the ground. But we can't see what happens to their spirit. And so some people believe that the spirit continues to exist after death. Others believe that the spirit ceases to exist. That that's just the end of it. That it's like what it was like before you were born. Is there life after death? The passage from the Bible we're looking at this morning is Mark chapter 12, verses 18 to 27. Is there life after death? At the start of this passage, we're introduced to the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a group of Jewish priests who controlled the temple in Jerusalem. Shortly before this, Jesus has thrown the traders out of the temple. That would, of course, have upset the Sadducees. And now they come to Jesus with a question. And as Mark, in this gospel, introduces us to the Sadducees, he tells us that they say that there's no resurrection. This group of Jewish priests did not believe in life after death. And they believed that once you died, that was the end. That was it. They believed the books of the Bible that Moses had written, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But they didn't believe that the rest of the Bible was a message from God. And as they come to Jesus, they ask him a question about what Moses had written. They say, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. They're referring to what Moses wrote in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5. Moses had said that if a man and woman get married, if they have no children, if the man has a brother, the brother is to marry the widow so that the first man's family line doesn't die out. And as they come to Jesus, they tell Jesus about a situation in which there were 7 brothers. One of them marries a wife, they have no children, the man dies. So as Moses had said, the second man, the brother, marries the widow. Again, there are no children and the man dies. So the third brother marries the woman. And so on until all 7 marry the woman. They all die and none of them have any children. And then the woman herself dies. And the question the Sadducees asked Jesus is, at the resurrection, if there is a resurrection, whose wife will she be? Since the 7 were married to her. Verse 23. The Sadducees are convinced that there is no answer to this question. They didn't believe that there was a resurrection. Their thinking is that, well, the first man can't be married to the wife in heaven because the others were all married to her on earth, so that wouldn't be right. And they can't all be married to her in heaven because it wouldn't be right for a woman to be married to many different men in heaven. They're convinced that there is no answer to their question. They're really asking, is there life after death? And they believe that the resurrection is inconsistent with what Moses taught. So that's the first thing we see. Is there life after death? How will Jesus answer that question? Is belief in the resurrection inconsistent with what Moses taught? Secondly, we see that there is life after death. Jesus answers these people by telling them, first of all, that they're wrong. Are you not in error? Verse 24. And then he tells them why they're wrong. Because you do not know the scriptures. They believed the first 5 books of the Bible that Moses had written, but they didn't believe the rest of the Old Testament. And Jesus says that's why they're wrong in their view. Because they don't know the whole of the message that God has given to his people. And that can be the same with us as well. Often when we misunderstand God, when we misunderstand ourselves, when we misunderstand life, it's because we don't know the Bible, because we don't know all of the Bible. We know bits of the Bible. We have our favourite verses, our favourite passages, our favourite books. But often we don't know the whole of the Bible, from start to finish. If you were to pick up a novel and flick through it and read a few random pages, it wouldn't make much sense. And it's like that with the Bible as well. If we want to really understand the Bible, over time we need to read it from start to finish, and to get the whole picture, to get the whole of what God is saying to us. Jesus tells these Sadducees that they're in error because they do not know the scriptures. Because they do not know the scriptures or the power of God. They hadn't personally experienced God working in their lives. And so they were mistaken. And if we have no personal experience of God working in our lives, if we haven't heard God speaking to us, if we haven't listened to what God said, if he hasn't changed our lives, then our understanding of the world we live in will be mistaken, it will be wrong. We can't understand spiritual things unless God works in us and helps us. So Jesus tells the Sadducees that they're wrong. And then he says, when the dead rise. Verse 25. He's telling us the dead will rise. There will be a resurrection. People will come back to life. When the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Nobody will get married in heaven. We'll all be like angels. Angels are single. They're not married. That's what we'll all be like in heaven. And so the Sadducees' problem disappears. Their question is irrelevant. There will be no marriage in heaven. And then Jesus goes on to tell them about the dead rising. He says, have you not read in the book of Moses? So he's going to the part of the Bible that they agree with, to the books of Moses. And he says, in the account of the burning bush, how God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's referring to Exodus 3, verse 6. When God introduced himself to Moses, he introduced himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At that stage, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all dead. But it wouldn't make sense for God to introduce himself as the God of people who'd ceased to exist, of people who were no more. And so Jesus says, he is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob continued to exist, and one day they would rise again. So Jesus shows the Sadducees from the books of Moses that they agreed with, that there is life after death, that there is a resurrection. And within a week of Jesus saying this, Mark tells us in chapter 16 of the Gospel that the women went to Jesus' tomb, but they didn't find his body there. Instead, they found an angel who said, he has risen. And so within a week of this, Jesus himself proved that there is a resurrection by rising from the dead. He is the one who conquered death. He's the one who makes it possible for there to be life after death. There is life after death. We can't see it with our own eyes. And yet Jesus proved that there was life after death by rising from the dead. First, is there life after death? Second, there is life after death. Does it really matter? Does it really make any difference? Third, not believing in life after death is a big mistake. When Jesus speaks to the Sadducees here, he starts with the fact that they're wrong, and he ends with the fact that they're wrong. In verse 24, he says, are you not in error? And in verse 27, he ends by saying, you are badly mistaken. And those words, error and mistaken, in the original language are actually the same word. He starts and ends by telling them they're mistaken, and they're badly mistaken. If you don't believe that there is life after death, Jesus says that you are badly mistaken. This is a very serious error. That believing in the resurrection is not a secondary issue. It's not a matter of opinion. There are some things in Christian belief that the Apostle Paul refers to in Romans 14 verse 1 as disputable matters. Christians can have different views on them. But the resurrection is not one of those disputable matters. It's not something that you can take or leave. If you're to be a Christian, you must believe in the resurrection. When Paul is writing to Christians in Corinth, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 12 to 14, there are some people there who said that there was no resurrection of the dead. And Paul says, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. If there is no resurrection, your Christian faith is a waste of time. There is a resurrection. Everyone will rise. God will bring our bodies back. Daniel tells us in the Old Testament, some will rise to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. As Jesus said in Matthew 25, verse 46, then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. Those who don't love the Lord, those who are not living for Him, those who are not trusting in Christ, will go, Jesus says, to eternal punishment. They will suffer God's wrath on their disobedience forever. Jesus himself said in Revelation 22 verse 12, "Look, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, and I will give to each person according to what they have done." Jesus is very clear. Sin will be punished. Those who don't turn to Him will suffer God's just judgment on their own sins. And yet, He came into this world to take that punishment Himself as He died on the cross. He came into this world to bear the punishment for everyone who would trust in Him. So come to Him, turn to Him, look to Him. Ask God to forgive you because of what Jesus did as He died on the cross. If you do that, you will escape this punishment. It's the only way anyone can escape the punishment we all deserve for disobeying God. Whether you believe it or not, one day you will rise. And some will rise to everlasting life, Others will rise to shame and everlasting contempt. As Jesus tells us, not believing in life after death is a huge mistake. And if we do believe in life after death, we are to remember that there is life after death. And being a Christian is not just about what happens here and now in this world. We are just passing through this world. As Peter says in 1 Peter 2 verse 11, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul." He describes Christians as foreigners, exiles. Now, of course, foreigners should be welcomed, foreigners should be accepted. But there's always something about foreigners that doesn't quite fit in. They're different. They don't really belong. Yes, they live here, but think of foreigners in your community. They live here, but they don't really belong here. They belong somewhere else. And Peter tells us that's what we're like. We don't really fit into this world. We are different from those around us. Yes, we live here, but we don't really belong here. We belong somewhere else. And so Paul tells us in Colossians 3 verses 1 and 2, "Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things." Since we've been raised with Christ, since we belong to heaven, our hearts are to be in heaven. Our minds are to be on heaven. We're not only to think about this world. Instead, we're to be thinking about spiritual things, about eternal things, about the life to come. Is there life after death? There is life after death. Not believing in life after death is a big mistake. We can't see it with our eyes. But there are lots of things that we can't see with our eyes. And yet they're true. The fact that we can't see them doesn't make them any less real. You can't see the air around you, and yet you know it's there. You can't see love, and yet you know it's real. There is life after death. One day, Jesus will return. And if you're trusting in him, he will bring you to live in his presence forever.